Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. Once again, it is truly humbling to introduce this evening's program. On a personal note and on behalf of the BASE community, it is really special to be a part of this event. I'd like to acknowledge right from the beginning Tali Nates and the special work she and her team do at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And to recognize our relationship and our partnership, we thank you for this opportunity, and we look forward to many more programs and events together. I'd like to also draw your attention to our next month's program, which will take place on the 20th of April. The speaker will be Liz Ellsby from Yad Vashem, and the topic is the changing face of Holocaust memorials in Poland, an artistic perspective. But in relation to this evening, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Tali Nates.
Thank you so very much. It's wonderful to be with all of you tonight, and wonderful to see many friends from South Africa, but from all over the world. It is also wonderful to have this partnership with the BASE. So it's the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. It is the BASE monthly offering. But for tonight, we also have the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research as our partners, and of course, Professor Wolf Gruner. Thank you. You are, of course, the head of this center, and we are so pleased to have you for the second time with us. Just to say to those that did not listen to Professor Gruner before, he was our keynote speaker at the Kristallnacht, the 9th of November commemoration in November 2020. And we were so amazed, touched, and learned so much that we asked Wolf, please, to come again and share his vast knowledge with us. So I will start with thanks. I really would like to thank our partners in the BASE, Rabbi Zulberg, Rob Katz, and of course, Moshe Zulberg, to then the team at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and of course, the team at the USC Shoah Foundation, the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and Wolf Gruner for joining us today. So tonight's topic is actually of great importance, and we are very grateful to have the opportunity to speak about it with Professor Gruner, because Defiance and Protest, as the title of the talk is, forgotten acts of individual Jewish resistance in Nazi Germany, and looking specifically at the 12 years of the Reich from 1933 to 1945 and acts of defiance in those years, is really important, because the challenge is that many say that there was no resistance. You know, the Abakovner famous words of they went like sheep to the slaughter or lambs to the slaughter, the issue of there was not enough resistance, why didn't they resist? You hear that just much too often. And I think Professor Gruner's research will break some of those stereotypes and myths about the lack of resistance. And we look very much forward to learn from you tonight. So let me introduce Professor Gruner to you officially tonight. Professor Wolf Gruner is the Shapell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at the United States, of the USC, University of Southern California, as well as the founding director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. He originally is from Germany, but lived in the United States for many years. And his talk will be followed by Q&A. So please make sure that you see the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to put all your comments and thoughts and questions in this Q&A. And we will make sure that after the talk, we will answer your question. Wolf, the Zoom platform is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Tali, and both organizations for having me for this talk. So I'm very grateful to be able to present my research results here. And let me begin with two stories of from Nazi Germany which took place late, kind of after the Nazis took power. They happened during the war. So when Hans Oppenheimer left his 4-story apartment house, it was pitch black outside. Because of Allied air raids, not a single light illuminated the street, nor the whole city of Frankfurt. When he left the house, it took a while to adjust his eyes, and then he moved slowly away from his home. Hans Oppenheimer knew that he was not supposed to be outside. There was a curfew for Jews for more than a full year now. He was shivering from fear and cold. He was only 17 years old. However, he had already worked for a full year in a forced labor camp. He anxiously awaited the British bombers to approach the city. When the sirens started to blare, he rushed to the next fire alarm post and pulled the handle. The alarm bell rang. This was the plan he had decided some weeks ago to divert the fire trucks from the actual bombing sites. The Gestapo arrested Hans Oppenheimer on December 10th, 1940. A court sentenced him to 3 years in prison for setting off more than a dozen wrong fire alarms. After almost 2 years in jail, where he twice tried to commit suicide, he was deported directly to Auschwitz, where he perished. But protest was also expressed much more openly. For example, even in Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich. A year later, in 1941, Hertha Reis, she was a 36-year-old Jewish woman who also, as almost everybody in the Jewish community, toiled as a forced laborer at the time. She had been earlier ordered to move out of her apartment to a small sublet room with her mother and her son. And now a judge evicted the family even from this tiny last resort of privacy. Having nowhere to go, she exclaimed in broad daylight in front of the Berlin courthouse, and I quote, "We lost everything. Because of the damned government, we finally lost our home too. This thug Hitler, the damned government, the damned people, just because we are Jews, we are discriminated against." End of quote. Amazingly, after 8 years of Nazi rule, these two Jews had still the courage to resist. Their stories challenge the still widespread belief, what Tali mentioned, that there was just a alleged passive suffering of German Jews under Nazi persecution. By contrast, during the last decade, my systematic research revealed that hundreds of Jews did resist Nazi persecution. Immediately in 1933, but still, as these two examples show, during the war. For the rediscovery of such forgotten acts, a reassessment of Jewish reactions towards Nazi persecution is imminent. So in my presentation, I will first briefly discuss the state of research and point to reasons why scholars kind of overlooked these kind of incidents of resistance. And thereafter, I will give a rough overview how German Jews did defy Nazi persecution between 1933 and 1945. So first, let us briefly discuss the development of research on this topic. As Tali mentioned, most of the public and the researchers kind of subscribe to the idea that particularly the German Jews did not really resist the terrors of the Third Reich. And this traditional perception of their alleged passivity had been nourished by the fact that historians have discussed Jewish resistance during the Holocaust mostly in terms of organized group resistance and especially armed resistance, and thus neglected individual acts of opposition. Moreover, in the beginning of the 1960s, Hannah Arendt, Bruno Bettelheim, and Raoul Hilberg all criticized the alleged lack of resistance. Although this was immediately questioned by Israeli scholars, and moral and spiritual resistance played a role in scholarly discussions since the 1970s, academia nevertheless settled on organized and armed resistance and its sole existence in the Eastern occupied territories. Hence, a thorough evaluation of individual Jewish resistance is missing in almost all prominent Holocaust narratives, even in those who focus on the integration of Jewish voices, like, for example, the widely acclaimed works of Saul Friedlander. And I think two main reasons may explain this unexpected void. One is a limited conceptual approach, and the other one is a limited source base for previous research. So let me briefly touch upon the conceptual framework. What I try to do here is not very much original, because there were already scholars in the 1950s and 70s, like the Israeli survivor Meir Dvoretsky, and the Australian historian Konrad Creed, and an East German survivor, Helmut Eschwege, who all tried to open up the definition of Jewish resistance towards individual activities. Similar views were raised in a debate on resistance in Nazi Germany in the 1980s on a kind of a general approach about resistance against the Nazis, not just Jewish resistance. And there, back then, young German historian Detlef Peukert kind of developed a scale which included nonconformity, defiance, and protest. Based on such ideas, what I did is I used this definition by Judah Bauer, which you can find in many works cited, and just added one word, individual. And with the addition of this one word, that is, Jewish resistance is now individual or group actions in opposition to known laws and actions of the Nazis, suddenly disobeying laws, exclaiming critique in public, kind of qualify as resistance. And for me, this is especially kind of justified because, in difference of other groups of the German population, Jews were kind of exposed to specific legislation and racial persecution. So when one applies this new definition to the analysis of the Nazi society, it does produce immediately astonishing results of individual opposition. And let me share some photographs which you might be familiar with, and let them read under this kind of new framework. So this is a very well-known photograph which you can find in a lot of Holocaust works. It shows Michael Siegel, a prominent lawyer in Munich in 1933. He is dragged by stormtroopers through the city. Usually you find this photograph used as an illustration of this kind of random, vile terror of the stormtroopers during the first weeks of after the Nazis took power. However, if you look at the sign Michael Siegel is kind of carrying, it says actually in translation, "I won't complain at the police anymore, at the police station." What happened is he tried to release a Jewish client and from police arrest. So he obviously disobeyed the police. Or let's take this photograph, which I usually used in my classes to illustrate local anti-Jewish measures, for example, to prohibit entrance of Jews to the municipal swimming pool. However, if you look at Dora Franken and her body language, this is not somebody who kind of is obeying. She really shows some resilience and disobedience in this picture. And moreover, she actually let somebody take a photograph of her in this with this posture. And if you start looking, which I did during my project, you find almost everywhere signs of this kind of sometimes more overt, sometimes less overt defiance. And for example, this Jewish family in a small town in Germany kind of let somebody take a picture in front of one of the most horrendous anti-Jewish slogans you can find. And they smuggled these negatives out of when they emigrated. And my most famous favorite photograph is this of Lizzie Rosenfeld, who did actually 3 acts of defiance when she sat on this bench. One was she sat on a bench which was only allowed for Aryans, not for Jews. Second, she let somebody take a picture of this crime. And then also she smuggled out the negatives so that they are now housed at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. But what I do is not just kind of trying to merely accumulating examples. I think it is also important to look at these acts more specifically, and that they actually are reactions towards a very contradictory development of anti-Jewish policies. And the last 30 years of Holocaust research in Nazi Germany actually revealed that there was a kind of very diverse development of national anti-Jewish legislation, regional and local measures, for example, by municipalities. And so Jews had to kind of adapt and react to this very kind of contradictory environment. And the knowledge about this diversity now enables us to understand much better what Jews actually reacted to. The second reason for the absence of individual resistance from the traditional Holocaust narrative lies in this previously very limited pool of sources. Most historians who focused on Nazi Germany and the attitudes and behavior of Jews would look into Nazi sources like administrative reports from the SS or the Gestapo, or they would use diaries and memoirs. And both of these types of sources didn't really mention individual acts of resistance. By contrast, my research is based on now more than 10 years of using hitherto unexplored materials. And my kind of discovery started when I sat in a Berlin State Archive and looked at Berlin police logbooks like diaries where police officers do their daily entrance. And in these police logbooks, which I kind of browsed for, or kind of read for traces of the persecution, among thousands of handwritten reports of about stolen bicycles, drunk people, exhibitionists, suddenly brief evidence of public protest by individual Jews surfaced. When I discovered those, I was struck because after 20 years at the time of Holocaust research on Germany, I never came across this kind of public protest. So I tried to follow up and see what happened to these Jews in these logbooks, and I went to these special courts, which usually were used after 1933 to punish Germans for political protest. And we always thought they were just for communists and social democrats. When I looked there, I didn't find the names from the police logbooks, but I found dozens and dozens of cases of individual Jews who either protested or in other ways kind of disrespected, disobeyed Nazi legislation. So then I thought maybe this is very specific for Berlin, because Berlin was kind of known as this more anonymous place where Jews could go to from the villages. So what I did is I did comparative microhistorical research on a dozen of German cities, including Hamburg, Frankfurt, Munich, Dresden, Leipzig, and also Vienna. And in all of these archives, I found more and more of these cases of protest, but also a much bigger variety of individual resistance acts. And to all this kind of paper documentation in these German archives, I added a thorough examination of 170 video testimonies from the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. And in those testimonies, in those interviews, survivors actually confirmed some of my archival findings, but they also provided new astonishing insights. So let me start to kind of to give you a brief review how these individual acts of defiance and protest developed over time, and give you some examples there. What you can find already is that against the boycott of shops and the dismissal from jobs and public positions individual Jews, but also Jewish organizations intervened, often with written petitions. And such entreaties you can find a large number in almost every German archive. And they don't stop in 1933, they go on also until the 1940s. And we published recently a book on these, not just in Germany, but also in France and the Protectorate in other European countries. Yet, as police records and video testimonies reveal, immediately after the Nazis took power, Jews started to protest anti-Jewish acts in public. For example, in Frankfurt, several Jews were prosecuted already in March and April 1933 for publicly criticizing the beatings and murders of Jews by stormtroopers, as well as the torture of Jews in these wild early concentration camps. And one example, on April 1st, 1933, the day of the notorious anti-Jewish boycott, the state court in Frankfurt punished the merchant Erich Löwenstein, he was born in 1908, with a harsh sentence of 1 year in prison for spreading rumors. Just a few days earlier, Löwenstein had criticized kind of the anti-Jewish developments and talked to some members of the Nazi party and interrogated them, what are the goals of the Nazis? Do they want to drive out the Jews from Germany? Do they want to harm the Jews in any way? And he kind of criticized that Jews had, or that there are news about Jews who had been killed during the first weeks. So he was punished also with 1 year in prison for doing this. As police records and also Shoah Foundation interviews reveal, about 1933, Jews did not stop by criticizing verbally. They also fought Nazi propaganda and the regime itself. Throughout the 1930s, Jews were arrested in Munich, Hamburg, and other cities for besmearing displays of anti-Semitic newspapers, for contesting the Hitler salute, or for destroying Nazi flags, posters, and symbols. And this is my first example. David Bornstein, a merchant, he was, as you see, born in 1897. In 1936, he tried to destroy the swastika logo on a public bus. And here you see a kind of a blow up of the Gestapo photo of this logo. And I hope you can see these 3 prominent scratches over the swastika. What he tried to do was, with his walking sticks, with both hands, he scratched the sign 3 times. He was put on trial and received 5 weeks in jail for this act of defiance. Interestingly, after he was released, later on, he was incarcerated in concentration camps as one of the victims of the so-called asocial raid in June 1938. Because of this act of defiance, he had a criminal record. And at the time, all Jews with even minor criminal records were put in concentration camps. There, many of the Jews actually died, and but fortunately, Bornstein was released and could make it out to Palestine immediately after the release. And here you see the Gestapo reenacting how Bornstein tried to destroy the swastika when he was waiting for the departure of the bus, because he was talking to his wife, which is impersonated by the conductor of the bus who actually denunciated Bornstein, and this was used as evidence in the trial. Especially the kind of frequent anti-Jewish demonstrations and riots produced a lot of reactions by the persecuted Jews. So, for example, in Berlin in 1935, there was a wave of anti-Jewish demonstrations, and in July, the police found a very small business card size flyer in a mailbox. And this flyer contained the following message, and I quote, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler," end of quote. During the months of July in 1935 alone, the Berlin police arrested more than 100 Jews, most of them for offenses against the German state and the Nazi Party, similar to this anonymous flyer here. Quite remarkable was the fact that the Gestapo emphasized in her monthly report of July that Jews were born with disrespect for state authority. These summer riots in Berlin were followed by local anti-Jewish measures, and you all noticed the notorious racist Nuremberg laws, which limited the individual freedom of German Jews even more. However, all over Germany, from Cologne to Königsberg, Jews still ignored, for example, municipal prohibitions to visit public swimming pools, cinemas, theaters, operas. Others went to German courts to demand their rights when they were dismissed from jobs, and so on. And some also spoke up in public, like Rosalie Kowalski in Frankfurt. She was born in 1887 and repeatedly in public cursed the Hitler Pack and told everybody that Goebbels would just tell lies. She was arrested and received 6 months in prison in 1937. Most of the public critique of Jews when they were denunciated was punished under this law, the law against treacherous attacks, which was issued in December 1934. This served the Nazis as really a tool against all political opponents. But my research reveals that these special courts used this law widely against Jews. And in almost every holding of local special courts in German archives, you find cases, dozens and dozens of cases against Jews. But even more astonishing is that even acts of physical self-defense of Jews emerge in numbers from the news sources. For example, the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive reveals that Jewish men got frequently into brawls with stormtroopers on the street or with Nazi neighbors who were discriminating against Jewish neighbors. For example, in Berlin, Frank Teilig, you see here a picture after his successful immigration, he beat up 2 stormtroopers who terrorized an old Jewish lady in his apartment building. He got only out because there was a sympathetic policeman who let him go, and he immediately left Germany to Shanghai. But not only against individuals, Jews try to defend themselves physically or attack them physically. Let me try to share a video testimony from the Shoah Foundation with you.
Courage or something. Der Stürmer, that was a German newspaper which I can remember was always displayed in glass display cases on public buildings, and I can remember so well looking at it. And they had these horrible caricatures of Jews, these little threatening men with these hooked noses. And in any case, Der Stürmer had when my Uncle Fritz's father died, who had also been a lawyer, there was a front page story in the Stürmer. His name was Josef Thal, that when Dr. Joseph Thal died and the authorities went into his home, in his basement they found the bodies of Jewish virgins and children. And he had probably used their blood in Passover rituals. That was the story on the Stürmer. My Uncle Fritz, his son, had been an officer in the German during World War I, and as a matter of fact had won the Iron Cross, which is, I don't know, it's the highest, but a very high decoration. And when he read that story in the Stürmer, he put on his World War I uniform, his riding boots, his riding crop, put his medal on his chest, and went down to the Stürmer's office. And Streicher, Julius Streicher, was the editor. And he marched up there in his uniform and up to the receptionist and said, I want to see, Herr Streicher. And the receptionist said, I'm sorry, you have no appointment. And my uncle just sort of pushed him aside and walked in there and walked up to Streicher's desk. And Streicher looked up surprised, to see this uniformed German officer, and Uncle Fritz said, "Did you know Herr Dr. Joseftal?" And Streicher said no, and my uncle took his whip and said, "Then meet his son," and beat him a couple of times, turned around fully expecting to be arrested, to be shot, to be something, walked out. Nothing ever happened to him.
So this is a remarkable story from this interview, and the story is actually confirmed by another survivor from Nuremberg. There is some validity to this, and also all the other kind of evidence we have that there was so much more physical self-defense than we were ever aware of. However, one has to say, not everybody was acting so courageously. So, for example, Paul Malch, he was a leather merchant in Düsseldorf, wrote hundreds and hundreds of family letters to his son in the United States. They are now at the Holocaust Museum in DC. Not one of these letters had a single line with critique of the Third Reich or the anti-Jewish measures. And I think the clear reason is the fear of censorship here. However, even Paul Malch tried to defy the regime when he kind of didn't see a risk for himself or his family. So in 1937, he was on a business trip in the neighboring Netherlands. And on the stationery of the hotel where he stayed, he wrote a fierce letter with complaints and critique about the Nazi leadership, about the anti-Jewish persecution to his son in the United States. And I think this example illustrates why so many letter exchanges we have such an apolitical tone because of fear of censorship. Let me come to the program of November 1938, which I already talked in detail about in a previous talk. Here again, Jews were actively responding in a variety of ways. Some saved religious objects from burning synagogues. Others secured goods from devastated stores or apartments. Some took pictures or made lists of destroyed buildings and shops. In many of these cases, the police arrested them and confiscated cameras and film rolls. And only from police logbooks we actually know that this happened because of the entries of police officers. And I shared in my other talk, but I wanted to share this here too, these where Jews documented their the destruction as to document the crimes. So here you have a series of pictures from the attacks on a private home in Nuremberg, which were clearly taken to kind of as a critique of against the violence. And they all show the horror of Kristallnacht, how it was actually experienced by individual families. Jews not only documented the violence and the crimes, they also spoke up in public the next day or during the next weeks. So for example, in Frankfurt, Henriette Schäfer, a Jewish woman who was born in 1882, she entered a shop the next day after the attacks, and she asked the owner, and I quote, "What are you saying about the fact that everything is being destroyed and the synagogues are arsoned?" End of quote. The neighbor, the shop owner, responded with an official narrative that the people are outraged about the murder of a German diplomat by a Jew. Schäfer replied, quote, "This is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scamps, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. She received 6 months in prison for this critical comment. A few days not only public critique was issued, but even some Jews also tried to either defend themselves or to attack the attackers. So for example, in Peine, in a small town in Lower Saxony, a group of SS men invaded the family apartment, the apartment of the Marburger family during Kristallnacht. And they started to beat up the father of the family and destroy the furniture, as you have just seen in these pictures. Hans, the son of the family, 17 years old, tried to fight these SS men off. Unfortunately, he was alone, and the three older SS men easily overwhelmed him. They dragged him out of the house and locked him into the synagogue, where one SS man shot him to death before they set the synagogue ablaze with gasoline. In another case, Daisy Gronowski, she was 16 years old. She lived in one of the retraining camps where Jewish teenagers prepared themselves for the emigration to either Palestine or other countries. And many of these, almost all of these camps came under attack during the Kristallnacht. And let me share how she talks about this. So the situation is the main building is invaded by the stormtroopers. The teenagers are kind of summoned there in the dining hall, and then the stormtroopers start to beat up first the male teenagers, and then they also start to beat up the female teenagers, and that's the situation she is talking about.
I mean, 5'0", I'm 5'1", 5'0", and I'm a skinny little girl. And all of a sudden, it wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember getting one on the back, and that was it. I just walked through very slowly, looking at all of them. Now here, big tough guys. You want to hit a little girl? What can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one on the back. It hurt. And I got to the end of the line. One of them grabs me, grabs this hand, the right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I had learned a little trick, and that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him, and I started fighting, and I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand. I used the knife. I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his stomach. I don't know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had told me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy beating up on him. So a couple of the guys saw it, and they dragged him underneath a bed or some kind of a sofa type thing that hadn't been kicked over so that the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, but he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off.
So this is a remarkable story which she's telling us here. And it is, she is one of the persons which I found frequently in my research where Jews, female and male, repeatedly defied the Nazis, not just once, but in kind of in several instances. So for example, Daisy Gronowski, after she fled, she was caught and arrested. She kind of escaped twice during the next weeks from arrests and finally made it out to England before the war broke out. So what I call resistance careers, when people frequently defied the system. So after the pogrom, there was an immediate set of new anti-Jewish national restrictions, like exclusion from public schools, public welfare, forced labor was introduced. And the archives in Frankfurt, Hamburg, Vienna, and Leipzig are full of files showing how Jews, even then, after this violent attack, still disobeyed anti-Jewish rules. For example, many defied the order to hand over their precious metals in the beginning of 1939. Some defied to wear these specifically marked identification cards. And then really surprising for me was to find dozens and dozens who defied the order to adopt the discriminatory middle name Sarah in Israel. We always assumed the Nazis just obliged Jews to adopt them. But in Germany, when you change your name, you have to actually apply for a name change. That's a kind of following a law. So dozens of Jews never applied for this name change, and so didn't adopt these discriminatory names. For example, in Berlin, the 68-year-old painter Max Antlers declined the repeated request to fill out the necessary application forms, and even did this in front of the police officer who summoned him at the police station. Or in Leipzig, 73-year-old Ida Schneider didn't apply for the identification card and refused to adopt the name Sarah. She was only detected by coincidence in 1941. That means 3 years later, and then was tried and received 7 months in prison as a sentence for these kind of acts of defiance. And Jews still spoke up against national and local anti-Jewish measures. For example, in Vienna, at the municipality's housing office, Dr. Arthur Singer loudly cursed Hitler after having been expelled from his municipal apartment in summer 1939. At the housing office, Singer even urged fellow Jews who were sitting and waiting there to join his protest against these new city orders and to storm the city offices. And these kind of individual acts of protest didn't even stop in wartime. For example, in Berlin, the former tailor Alfred Levitan, he was born in 1913, he was already in jail for public comments harming the German states. He was punished with 9 months in prison. However, this sentence didn't stop him. In spring 1940, in jail, Levitan smuggled letters into mail order catalogs, which were printed in prison, calling for an uprising and blaming the German war on Hitler's mistake to persecute the Jews. Local restrictions were disregarded too. In July 1940, in Berlin, the police chief limited the shopping hours for Jews to 1 hour in the late afternoon. Hedwig Hornung ignored this rule, and when she approached a shop owner, he declined her request to sell her some bread, kind of in other hours. Then she snapped and exclaimed, quote, "The new decree, this is too much. Soon we won't get ration cards anymore either, and we will die a wretched death," end of quote. She got also half a year in prison for this critical comment. And some Jews even kind of defied multiple local restrictions. For example, Max Mannheimer, who was a forced laborer in Bohemia, he actually left in his diary, and this is the only quote I found in diaries about this kind of defiance and protest. Quote, "My home is in a wooden hut behind this tool shed. From there I go to the public park, despite the 8 p.m. curfew, and despite the ban for Jews to visit the park. On my way, I count the signs with the slogan, 'Forbidden for Jews.' In total, there are 6. Later, at 11 p.m., I rip the signs out of the ground and throw some of them in the bushes and some of them in the creek. However, all my courage proved futile. The next evening, all the signs had reemerged. And for a second time, I don't have the courage. I'm just not a hero," end of quote. Interestingly, while this was important for him to write about it in his diary in 1940, Max Mannheimer didn't mention this in his interview for the Shoah Foundation in 1996. And I think you all would agree with me that his self kind of description at not being a hero is really kind of too humble, I have to say. So when Nazis penalized most public protest under the Treacherous Attacks Law, many acts of defiance were also kind of punished using different legislation. For example, when Jews ignored or resisted to hand over their radios, they were punished under the law against radio crimes. Laura Rechnitz in Vienna was sent to jail using the German penal code after she had broken the curfew for Jews introduced in September 1939. Breaking the curfew to visit bars, restaurants, cinemas, and theaters was very common among Jews, regardless of age. But some Jews broke the curfew for other reasons, as we just saw with Max Mannheimer, or remember the young Hans Oppenheimer who set off wrong fire alarms in Frankfurt. Interestingly, Jews were also tried for treason. In Munich, the former real estate broker Benno Neuberger, a man in his 60s, he saw the new order to brand the Jews with a yellow star as his last straw. He had already lost his children to immigration. He was alone with his wife. He had lost his business. And he always had perceived himself as a proud German from Munich, despite Hitler's attacks on the Jews. But after the order, the law or the decree about the yellow star, he felt ostracized, humiliated, and utterly unprotected. However, he still didn't want to give in. So between September 1941 and February 1942, Neuberger applied onto these kind of post-stamps, as you see here, these Hitler post-stamps. He applied these post-stamps on dozens of postcards and wrote abusive comments on them. For example, the first postcard read, I quote, "The eternal mass murderer Hitler, disgusting, exclamation mark." Another, and this is really a very foresighted comment, another comment was, "Murderer of 5 million." He was arrested because he made a mistake, and he was first interrogated by the Gestapo, and you can see here the Gestapo photo. And if you look closely on the left photo, you see a bruise on his next to his ear. So he was obviously tortured. He was then brought to the People's Court in Berlin, where he was tried for treason. However, still there, and after the torture, he spoke out and he exclaimed on trial that he hated Hitler, especially for the pronouncement of January 1939, where Hitler announced that if there will be a world war, this will be the end of the European Jewry. For everything what he did, he received the death penalty and was decapitated in September 1942. So throughout the war, you have other forms of defiance like sabotage, escape from forced labor. We find escape from camps, arrest from deportations, and especially, and this you all know, many thousand Jews actually went into hiding in Germany, which was also, or has to be perceived as a clear act of defiance. So let me come to a conclusion. 3 weeks after Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the 30-year-old Edith Britz, she wrote a letter that was intercepted by the Gestapo. She had been already earlier denunciated for race defilement and for having political conversations with non-Jewish Germans. Fortunately, in these instances, witnesses had vouched for her and no repercussions had followed for her. However, in the confiscated letter, the Jewish woman from Berlin described that one morning at 6 a.m., 2 police officers knocked on her door. In that moment, as she describes in the letter, she felt like she would do anything to prevent them from arresting her. Edith Britz, and I quote, wrote, "I'm so upset that I could attack anybody who wants to come into my path. I will go crazy if there will be more. They stole my sleep. They stole everything from me." End of quote. This quotation reveals the level of anxiety, anger, and repulsion that many Jews seem to have felt after experiencing years of anti-Jewish policies and often personal attacks and persecution. So it is not too far-fetched to assume that such emotions might have triggered many of the individual acts of defiance of Jewish men and women. So defining, as I did in this research, resistance as any individual or group action against laws, actions, and attention of the Nazis changes our perspective tremendously. Now we can understand for the first time correctly why there is a trope of the so-called impudent Jews in many Gestapo and SS reports. Previously, historians, and including myself, we thought they just put this in to justify harsher measures. But now with this background, what we found in the archives here, it actually referred to actual opposition and protest of individual Jews. In reality, almost every Jewish man or woman developed particular and over time changing strategies in response to the persecution. First, many Jews defied Nazi propaganda or fought against economic measures, then against local violent attacks and local restrictions, later against segregation and forced labor, and at the end against deportations. So I kind of systematized 5 prominent types of individual Jewish resistance. One is contesting Nazi propaganda. The second one is oral protest. The third one is written protest. Then the fourth one is defying anti-Jewish laws and restrictions. And the last one is self-defense against attacks, physical self-defense. Some might question if such acts can be counted as resistance. But to be clear, it is not up to the public today. It's not up to me as a scholar or other scholars. And to be frank, it's not even up to the victims to decide what was resistance. Who defined what is resistance or was resistance was the perpetrator themselves. The Nazis punished ruthlessly every critical word, every defiant act, as small as it was, with jail sentences. They brought Jews into concentration camps. So in the end, it only matters what the perpetrators, the Nazis, thought about the impudent Jews. As my research indicates, individual Jewish resistance was neither the exception, probably it was also not the rule, but it was much more widespread than we ever thought. Such courage existed in almost any strand of the Jewish population, regardless of gender, age, beliefs, or social status. Many cases of defiance and protest remain still unknown because not every incident left traces for the historian, and many archives still are not explored. So, because the persecuted performed many acts of opposition against anti-Jewish policies, the image of the passive Jewish victim needs to be thrown out forever. What we need to make sure is that these courageous acts still have to be incorporated into our general narrative of the Nazi persecution of the Jews. And it's not only to preserve the memory of these courageous acts, but also to understand them as an array of deliberate individual reactions and actions to diverse and changing local, regional, and central Nazi measures. As the Berlin rabbi Nussbaum recalled, and I quote, this is from the 1960s, "We were besieged in 100 of different manners, and therefore we fought back in 100 different manners." End of quote. Acknowledging that so many people resisted Nazi measures, finally, I think, gives really agency back to the German Jews. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wolf. I think your conclusion is just so important because we do have to include those stories in our museums, in our ways of telling the story of the Holocaust. And I think your research is of utmost importance. I think everyone agrees. There are a few excellent questions, and we will take some time to answer them. Michelle Blumenau is asking, would non-Jews who defied the Nazis be treated as harshly in the same way? So in the records, did you see differences between Jews and non-Jews?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So first of all, this also in a way hints to something I didn't talk about, but came really evolved also over the course of my research, that quite a few Germans actually spoke up in favor of Jews. So they also criticized anti-Jewish measures, the persecution of the Jews in general. And so there is some comparison. However, it is really hard to do because it depended so much on the place, the time, the court, the prosecutor, the judge, and even sometimes the situation, the witnesses, yeah, were they reliable or not. So it is, in a way, it is really hard to compare, I have to say. In the end, I think there were many instances where Jews were treated very harshly. But I also want to disclose that there are some instances where I was surprised that actually Jews were not treated harshly. Some were, quite a few were actually acquitted. Some because they couldn't really, because we have to really remind ourselves, the Nazis still perceived Germany as a legal state. So you have to follow the, to a certain extent, these legal kind of frameworks. So if there was not enough evidence, yeah, if there was one witness would say, she said this, and she said, no, I actually didn't. So in difference to Benno Neuberger, who was saying, yes, I did this in front of the People's Court, many Jews tried to get out of this really dangerous situation by just kind of declining that they have done this, right? Or they had witnesses who vouched for them. So, and then sometimes even there are instances of sympathy. So for example, very late in 1941 in Hamburg, a very desperate Jewish woman who, it was kind of when the mass deportation started. She was so desperate, she wanted to be arrested. So she went to a police station and yelled at the police officer, "Down with Hitler." And she obviously was arrested. She was put on trial, and the judge gave her only 2 weeks in prison, which was kind of already done with the arrest, because the note says that she acted out of despair. So it really is remarkable what we see here, that there are levels of, that we can't kind of look at the Third Reich as a homogeneous entity. It always depends on individuals, on both sides, on the perpetrator side, but also on the victim side.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. Our friend from Houston Holocaust Museum, Mary Lee Wiebeck, is saying, thank you for your conceptual approaches to this research. Years ago, I was privileged to attend an institute you were part of at the USHMM, and you spoke of your emerging research into the idea that anti-Jewish decrees were not only created top-down, but also were created at local levels, so from grassroots up as well, and by the people. It strikes me that these two bodies of thought and research are interestingly connected. Can you speak about the connections to your thinking? What do these parallel inquiries help us to understand about law and about the culture at the time?
Yeah, that's a good observation, and it's a little bit kind of inquiring about my personal trajectory as a scholar, because I was kind of educated in Germany as kind of a historian who looks at institutions. So in the beginning, I was all about exploring how institutions acted, not people. But when I did my first study on Jewish forced labor outside of concentration camps as my PhD, I realized that forced labor was organized differently on the local level. And it depended on local individuals in municipalities, in private enterprises, how the forms of forced labor emerged. And this led me then to look into the people acting in these institutions. And I realized suddenly there were these stark differences, even within one municipality, where the head of the welfare department was a fanatic, but then he was not even a member of the Nazi party. Yeah, or you had somebody who was a member of the Nazi party, but his department was not acting really initiative or didn't do any initiatives against the Jews. So there are all these contradictions which emerged in my research, which then led me to think, if these people act differently, and it depends really on the situation, the environment, how did this actually impact the Jewish population? And that led me then to look more into Jewish reactions to these very diverse policies. And that's when I realized many people asked the question, why didn't the Jews leave when the Nazis took power? Because it was so hard to find out what actually was going on when you are in Hamburg and the welfare department is really kind of cutting welfare payments to Jews, but the kind of business department is very favorable in Jews still. But you are in Frankfurt, the first what the municipality does in 1933 is cutting contracts with Jewish business owners. So that's how diverse the policies were. Yeah, and so it wasn't, for many Jews, it was not really easy to find out what will going on, where does this lead to, and so on. So I think that's kind of, and this in the end led me then to this coincidental find in this police logbook, which then started this now 12 years of research on this topic.
That's amazing. So actually, people are asking, did you publish anything? Jihom is asking, can you share with us your work? Where can we find it?
The first one I just talked about is kind of the different forms of Jewish forced labor I published in 2006 with Cambridge University. It's called Jewish Forced Labor, Nazi racial aims and Nazi racial aims and economic needs. The first thing I published about this kind of protest and defiance I talked today about are some scholarly articles. And then in my last book, which is titled in English, The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia. That's where I first actually tried to have what I call an integrative approach. It's not just to kind of illuminate Jewish voices, but really look into Jewish actions and reactions. So I look at both. What did the perpetrators do, Germans and Czechs? And then how did the Jewish community and the Jewish individuals react to this? And there I have subchapters on Jewish defiance and protest in Bohemia and Moravia in it. And I just finished, and this is one of the very few positive things from COVID that gave me a little bit of time to finish this manuscript, which is called Impudent Jews, Forgotten Acts of Jewish Defiance and Jewish Resistance, which is, so the manuscript is done, but I need to find an agent because I wrote it in a way where I tell stories. So it's not a scholarly book. It's much more for the broader market. And I'm in the process to find an agent right now.
Looking very much forward to read this one. I'm sure it will be absolutely fascinating. Sid Isaacson is asking, did any Jews jailed for resistance, some that you told us and many others, survive the camps, the war, after being in prison or in the camps?
Yeah, so interestingly, there is a very kind of ambivalent process going on. Those who rebelled in the 1930s until Kristallnacht, when they were punished, tried, and jailed, they usually took this as the last straw to leave the country. So many of those actually survived. I kind of hinted to the change when David Bornstein in Hamburg, who kind of scratched the Nazi logo, the swastika, he actually was on the border, kind of on the brink of being actually suffering when he was incarcerated in a concentration camp. There was a big chance that he could get out, but he got out. So still till Kristallnacht and the beginning of the war, Jews could kind of emigrate. And usually when they were punished and got out of jail, they immediately left. During the war, some of the Jews kind of survived because they were not denunciated. So there are some, and that's when I find them in the video testimonies of the Shoah Foundation. But during the war, when they were imprisoned, they usually afterwards were deported. And then it depended on their individual trajectory if they survived the concentration camps, the forced labor, and the extermination process. So there are some survivors, but it is also, for me, as I try to kind of share, since many survivors never perceived that these small acts, these small deeds were resistance, it is really also hard to find those survivors that they actually talk about. And when I give my talks, then suddenly families of survivors come to me. Oh yeah, actually, my grandmother told me that she did this the same. Yeah, some like saving. A colleague of mine who was in the history department, he told me that his parents, they saved a painting which was slashed during Kristallnacht and saved this as a kind of a memory of Kristallnacht. So there are countless stories out there still to explore and to discover.
And actually, two stories are coming up right here. So Jeffrey Davis is sharing. First of all, he's thanking you for a fascinating presentation, but he's sharing, and he would love to send you the information. So Jeffrey, please, I'll be happy to connect you, of course, to Wolf. But he's saying that his father's cousin, she was inspired by Rosa Luxemburg. So she was, he actually met her. She was still alive when he met her in the 1970s, and she was a rabid communist. She acted most defiantly for many years, and her name was Hedy Friedlander Davis. So, you know, here stories of defiance coming from the floor, and also Robin Blumenthal, that is saying your stories are very, very similar to the stories that she heard, you know, at home. So she recently found out that my grandfather was in a labor camp in 1933 because the police of the town could arrest any Jew they believed was acting in an inappropriate or defiant way. And it's exactly mirroring some of your stories. So you see that even between us, there are already stories coming up.
And that's why I say that this type of behavior is so much more widespread than we ever assumed. And I think there's so much more to discover. As I said, I'm a kind of a lonely ranger. I mean, I'm kind of a one-man show. And so I have limits in what I can research. There are so many archives, nobody looked for this at all. And there are so many survivors, as I said, and interviews we have to look at to find kind of similar stories. And so I think that should be also an incentive for others to kind of, to maybe to pursue this avenue and to find out more about this. I just wanted to make one remark. I kind of limited myself to focus really on individual resistance. And I wanted to say, I excluded stories I know, for example, where there was an overlap from individuals to organized resistance. So for example, Daisy Gronowski, the small woman which kind of cut the stormtrooper in this retraining camp from the Shoah Foundation interview, she actually tells in her interview that earlier on, she was in the Hashomer Hatzair group in Berlin. There is where she got her jiu-jitsu skills, which she kind of used to kind of defend herself against the stormtrooper. But this group had close contacts to a communist underground group. So she actually was a messenger for a communist underground group. So there is overlap that Jews participated and helped communist groups. But there was also problems because the communists knew that Jews are especially exposed and vulnerable. That's why there were limits to the cooperation and inclusion of Jews in these communist groups.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Maybe a topic for another talk. Let's try and take at least two questions very, very quickly. One very interesting one about Rassenschande. So is Rassenschande a form of resistance and defiance? And can you say more about why prior to the early 70s, as you spoke about it, were Jewish and non-Jewish writers and analysts or scholars reluctant to acknowledge resistance? What were the thinking, and where is there maybe the struggle now? And you mentioned Israel, so why in Israel but not in other places?
Yeah, so these are really interesting questions, and I want to actually use the opportunity to talk about Rassenschande or race defilement. There are some, I think, gray zones regarding individual defiance and actions. Race defilement is one, but I also wanted to raise, for example, suicide and also escape, which are, by some would say, this is just self-preservation. This is not really defiance. Under my kind of framework, I would say escape definitely is, hiding definitely is, and even in most cases, suicide. There are many cases where people who took their own lives actually left letters where they declare that this is an act of defiance. So we have some of those letters. Or, for example, one case in the police logbook in Berlin, a Jewish man took his own life on the grave of his grandparents, close to a memorial where the Jewish soldiers from the First World War were kind of buried. And he did this in a demonstrative act with a pistol, which he was not supposed to have because the Nazis confiscated these pistols and guns to exactly prevent Jewish revenge or Jewish attacks. So there are these gray zones, and I think this is case to case. One has to look at them, but I would not exclude them just from the outset. And by the way, not just race defilement, I discovered cases where friendships arose because of the persecution of the Jews between Jews and non-Jews. And I only came to them because they were kind of denunciated as race defilement. And they kind of made the case that they were not. But so there are all these interesting stories evolving when you do this research. The other thing about the writers, so there are two answers to this. One is Jewish writers during the 1930s, but also immediately after the war, were kind of, in a way, in the majority, still kind of under this impression Jews never really resisted. It was always kind of they tried to adapt to the situation under persecution. That's how Jewish history kind of is. There were some, like Tucholsky, who kind of had a discussion with Arnold Zweig about this. They talked then about that Jews need to resist and that they need to push Jewish organizations to do more in the 1930s. Yeah, so there is this kind of ambivalent view onto Jewish history and how Jews actually are supposed to behave. So I found this very interesting, and I think there's also much more to explore.
Absolutely. And as you said, you know, hopefully this is starting to change, you know, this outlook. Again, I mean, there are so many, you know, that I will not be able to maybe share all. But here, another story, Michael Golding, one of our dear volunteers, is saying, thank you so much. He loves listening to you. And he said, in 1938, my wife's father punched up a Gestapo officer just before he fled from Czechoslovakia. So, you know, you have all those amazing stories that coming out, and it will be amazing to actually, you know, compile just in our community in South Africa, you know, some of those stories. So please do send them to us. And, you know, Michael, it will be amazing if you can share a little bit of that story. It's very picturesque, this punching of a Gestapo officer.
And I just wanted to add, I mean, I think with this research, it is actually a chance to validate all these individual stories, which probably many people thought, is this really, was this really going on? Could somebody do this actually? But if you have all these cases together, then it makes sense. And then they are actually kind of, in a way, they speak the truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me put together the two last questions, and then we will close. First of all, someone is asking about, you know, Jewish doctors, Jewish professionals that were prevented from working, particularly in Berlin, but throughout Germany. Maybe if you can talk about professions. I mean, is there resistance in more upper, you know, more educated people? You told stories of older people that are resisting. That was quite striking. So that is the one. And the other one, I'll just put them together. When you then investigating resistance in different communities. For example, they're giving here in Theresienstadt, where laws are, there is developments of laws. All the time, the laws are becoming worse and worse. How should one go about understanding resistance as the laws, become worse, and then resistance has to change as well? So I thought these two questions maybe you can answer together.
That's not easy.
Sorry.
That's a tall task. So just quickly, what I try to do in the summary is I didn't find patterns of behavior in certain professions or in certain age groups or also regarding gender. So I have equal amount of female kind of resistors as male. I found all these amazing stories of elderly Jews who resist, and we suspected always the youngsters would do this or would be much more prone to this. The only pattern I see is maybe physical self-defense. There is a more male and more younger side to it, I would say, but that's practically, and critique after program night is more from women because the men were all arrested. So these are kind of patterns. Jewish doctors and other professions, they all did this also. There is no difference. I mean, my graduate student worked on Jewish doctors in labor and concentration camps, how they try to kind of use their little leeway to have to resist. Very similar to what I researched here. So I think there are no real patterns here. That's kind of, it's really up to this individual situation. How laws progressed. So that's an interesting, I thought, or many of my colleagues share this thought that the more the persecution progressed, Jews tried to adapt. And it was kind of, because they adapted step by step, that's why they didn't rebel. That's what I previously thought, right? Because they were so kind of in the process of adaptation that there was no sudden outburst. But as I try to make some points here, there are spikes where I found kind of spikes of anti-Jewish rebellion or reactions or defiance, and they are usually following either new laws, like the Nuremberg race laws, these kind of anti-Jewish riots, like in Berlin, Kristallnacht, or the mass deportations. So there are kind of all local restrictions also in the local settings. So there are certain spikes. Yeah, and interestingly, this is also corresponding to non-Jewish resistance and defiance on critique against anti-Jewish persecution, where I also thought there's more critique in the beginning when the Nazis took power, and later it thins out. That's also not true. The biggest findings I had where non-Jews defended Jews were actually before Kristallnacht. And the situation was because everybody feared a war with Czechoslovakia. And in this war situation, suddenly more and more people spoke up in favor of the Jews and against the persecution. So that's interesting that it's not a linear progression or digression.
Thank you. I know it's difficult to answer all the questions, but really, you did magnificently well, Wolf. So I will hand over to Rabbi Zulberg to close the evening. But from my side, just thank you very much for again, just sharing with us your vast knowledge. What a pleasure to learn from you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Tali, and thank you so much, Professor Wolf Gruner. Tonight was interesting, thought-provoking, beyond informative, and from a most unique perspective. So thank you very much. I'd also like to mention our partners for this event, the USC Shoah Foundation and the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. Thank you for this opportunity. Again, to recognize the base partnership with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Thank you, Tali, for tonight, but for all that you do, your passion and your commitment. It's very inspiring. And we look forward to further events and programs together. Thank you, Moshe Zulberg and Geronimo Ventek, for their support. We really could not do this without you. I also want to say thank you to Jordan Saltzman for her assistance this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope to see you all again soon. Keep safe and have a good night.